A show is about to open in 2 days. It features a power-packed pair of producers who would rewrite Broadway history with two of the biggest musicals of all time, Phantom of the Opera and Les Mis. The female lead is in one of the final rehearsals. It will be her place in history to sing the world a song so powerful, so vital, so memorable that it will immediately become a top 10 hit, get re-recorded more than 600 times, including 2 more trips to the top 10 by 2 others who are megastars in their own right. I can't fool you. You're listening to a musical theater podcast. You know the performer and you know the song. Elaine Paige is performing to an empty house, and she's doing one of the final run-throughs of memory, performing as Grisabella before the opening of Cats. The other performers watch from the wings. It's almost the only moment of the show where they aren't all dancing during the musical numbers. The orchestra rises in anticipation. This is the song that will make the show. In fact, it's the song that almost all the critics will point to as holding the entire show together. And a show that will go on to play tens of thousands of times, win every major award, break all records for the longest run and the largest return. It's a formula that's worked before. Andrew Lloyd Webber, the composer, has paired with lyricist Tim Rice, and the magic that is conjured with the fusion of these two genius minds never fails to move audiences. And then, breathlessly at first, she trills words that will soon be immortal. Daylight, I won't care if it finds me with no breath in my body, with no beat in my heart. Wait, what? No, those aren't the words. I really can't fool you. But they were almost the words. That's right. The lyrics to maybe the most immortal song in Broadway history were changed 2 days before the show opened. And that was after the female lead had to pull from the show because she snapped her Achilles tendon, before the producers declared what the director had done was not fit for the stage and threatened to pull the whole thing, before all the costumes were scrapped and redone 1 week before the opening. And these are just some of the things that almost derailed the show before it ever got started. But as we know, these obstacles were overcome. What had to happen for the show to get off the ground? And most importantly, why did it work? In the words of director Trevor Nunn, the theater creaked, the ghosts walked. And we'll find out where they went on this episode of Theater History and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater History and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. All right, well, it goes without saying that Elaine Paige also sang that song better than I just did. But on to our show, we are charging past 20,000 downloads. And in the interest of keeping this non-commercial for as long as I can, I'm resisting asking you for your money, but I can't tell you how much I value your attention. This week, I'm adding a new email address. It is theaterhistorypodcast, one word, @gmail.com. If you hear anything you like, anything you want to argue about, or have poignant thoughts about the New York Met bullpen, drop me a line. You honor me just by letting me know that you're out there. I will drop that email in the show notes so you don't have to remember the whole thing. But you either grow or you die. So if your email is about something else, please do drop the link on your social media. Tell a friend. Find a theater person you have a crush on and ask them if they'd like to go on a romantic date, and then take a long walk on a beach while you stream an episode of Theater History Mysteries on your mutually paired Bluetooth earbuds. I can't promise I know what this will do for your life or your date, but no matter what else, you will never have another date like it. Okay, anyway, if you can and you can support the show in any way, I really appreciate that. This is audience-driven and it is non-commercial, and I need you to keep doing this. Today, we move from the history of the original author of the poems to the musical productions. There is a ton to say about that original author. In the last 2 episodes, we're covering the life of T.S. Eliot. If you get a chance, it's worth listening to those before you take up this missive. But even if you've heard them before, a recap is in order. It goes something like this. Eliot was raised in St. Louis. He loved cats. He returned to his family roots in Boston. He was highly educated at a couple of prep schools and Harvard, and then Oxford, where he met Ezra Pound. He spent a year in France, where he met a medical student who he would dedicate his first really significant poem to, causing several to speculate that he had at least homosexual urges. But he married a British national named Vivian Haywood, and their marriage was a huge disaster almost from the get-go. And while she was in a sanatorium and he was in something more like a spa, he wrote a poem called The Wasteland, which was the defining literary work of modernist literature. It was many things, but not uplifting. It's serious, scholarly, dark, and heavy. After that, he was the most prominent literary figure in that movement, more significant even than James Joyce or Ezra Pound himself. And all this is happening in the late 19-teens and 1920s, largely while he's working with a publishing house where Virginia Woolf herself was a central figure. Things changed in 1933 when he would leave for America to go on a speaking tour, and he left his lawyers with instructions to divorce Vivian in his absence. He took a turn to the conservative. He converted to the Anglican Church. He became a British citizen. He ditched and alienated Virginia Woolf's publishing house for a new one, and he traded a series of racist letters with Ezra Pound. The new publisher made Eliot the godfather of his children, and he wrote to those godchildren and even to some adult friends some adorable letters with allusions to and poems about cats. Meanwhile, Ezra Pound went fully fascist and did all he could to advance Mussolini in Italy, and would eventually be captured by the Allies as an enemy combatant, caged, charged with treason, and eventually confined to an asylum. Eliot was doing better than that, and in 1939, he took those silly cat poems and published a silly little 14-poem kids book that nobody took seriously, mostly because they were not serious, but they were a very rare light diversion amongst his published works. They would be the last light fare that he would ever write. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948, and for good measure, he wrote some very successful plays, including some that played well on Broadway. He lived for 11 years with a friend, literary scholar, and muscular dystrophy sufferer named John Hayward, fueling more speculation about Eliot's sexuality. Hayward was the curator of Eliot's literature, but they split in 1951, and for the next 8 years, a woman named Valerie Fletcher was the caretaker of his literary estate. The two married in 1957, she being his junior by 40 years. Whew, that's a lot. So here are a few points worth remembering as we transition from the book of poems to the musical. First, without saying anything about what Eliot's sexuality actually was, it is fair to say that he was enormously guarded about it. His poems are largely about men who feel sexual urges towards women, but can't bring themselves to act on them. He was adamant that he didn't want to have a biography written, and part of his very overt turn to conservatism was that he liked that stiff upper lip and reserved approach to social relations. He did write some schoolboy banter that he was strangely attracted to, and it was all over the top with, let's call it, locker room talk, although one scholar has probably more aptly called it sexual excess. But this, too, is consistent with repressed sexuality of some sort. He's intensely private. There's almost no record of him having a satisfying or even a happy sex life until after he married Valerie, when he was, again, I'm searching for euphemisms here, past his sexual prime, but those locker room, schoolboy, sexual excess poems, it's almost like he was repressing something that all exploded out when he gave himself permission to be profane. But there's very, very little evidence that he was ever very happy in a sexual way. And if you think I'm dwelling on Eliot's sex life, maybe a little more than I should, my only defense is that this will all get connected to Cats the musical. But point number one is that even setting aside anything about his personal life, and there are good reasons to do that as well. For example, when Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Louis Menand took up the subject, he started it with this phrase, quote, T.S. Eliot's sex life. Do we really want to go there? Question mark, end quotes. So setting aside the voluminous speculation about T.S. Eliot's actual sex life, his literature and poetry do have extensive discussions of section sex and sexuality, and it is all angst-driven. Nobody has ever said what really stands out about T.S. Eliot's poetry is its free and open discussion and celebration of human sexuality. I guess I just said it, but I'm pretty sure I'm the first person ever to utter that sentence aloud, and here you were to be ear witnesses to this groundbreaking event. Anyway, T.S. Eliot, very sexually reserved. Second, Cats, which was published under the title Old Possum's Guide to Practical Cats, was not a big deal. Eliot won a Nobel Prize in Literature, but it sure wasn't for Cats, which was fun and light and intended to make people smile. In the Eliot canon, the critics and the reading public of the day didn't give it much attention, and even now, it barely rates a few pages or maybe a few paragraphs in the serious literary work on T.S. Eliot. There is nothing sexual in it, and Grisabella, the glamour cat, who some read as a prostitute, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, isn't even one of the characters. The third point is that Eliot was politically and socially conservative. If you're wondering what that bit about Old Possum and the title is a reference to, the title itself is an allusion to some of the unflattering stereotypes of people of color in Uncle Remus. And in case there was any uncertainty about whether that was an accident or unambiguously racist, remember that Old Possum is the nickname that was given to Eliot by open racist, anti-Semite, eugenics enthusiast, fascist, and traitor Ezra Pound. I should add to that narcissist and madman. Anyway, Pound gave Eliot the nickname Old Possum, and Eliot put Old Possum in the title of his book. So some have drawn connections between the racism of Uncle Remus, the racism of Ezra Pound, and the fact that Eliot was putting out in his poems. Now, Eliot wasn't as deep into it as Pound was, but there was a dark side to his conservatism, where he skirted that line between conservatism as a commitment to social conventionality to give meaning to life and conservatism to support, say, Ezra Pound. Let's just say that had King George V gone on a tear to eliminate every diversity, equity, and inclusion program in the UK during Eliot's lifetime, Thomas Stearns Eliot would have been just fine with that. The poetry and the philosophy of T.S. Eliot was definitely not about celebrating alternative identities. Sometimes critics will say he talked about poor people, but mostly the way you would talk about lab rats. So, our three takeaways about Eliot are: number one, he was sexually reserved, maybe repressed in both his life and his poetry. Number two, the book Cats was a fun and diversionary entry in the Eliot library, but definitely not part of the intellectual heft of T.S. Eliot's life and work. And three, he was socially conservative, probably to the point of being anti-Semitic and anti-Black, but even if he was not marching in a white hood and cape, he definitely was not trying to advance alternative identities. Probably the opposite. And what's weird about that is that Cats the musical succeeds because it is the opposite of almost every one of those things. It is a wild celebration of open sexuality. It is embraced by those with marginalized identities, especially the LGBTQ plus community. And the first line of defense against its plotless grandeur is the intellectual heft given to it by Nobel laureate for literature T.S. Eliot, who is credited with and won the Emmy for the stage book of the musical production. Okay, so how does that happen? Why is it that this musical becomes successful for all the reasons that the book is not? Okay, the time has now come to explore that and talk about the show itself. And I think I can promise you an almost completely novel take on Cats. The performer, Colton Krause, who played the role of Tumble Brutus, said in an interview that, quote, "I think you either love it or hate it. There's really no in between. I've never heard anybody go, I kind of like Cats." End quote. That is common reaction, and Colton Krause is dead right, but I kind of like Cats. I started life as an avowed Cats hater, the production, that is, not the animals, who are awesome, but doing this air quotes research on air quotes, I have gained an appreciation both for it and for Andrew Lloyd Webber. Gia Tolentino, who does research without air quotes, is an award winner for The New Yorker, and she deserves a separate and special award for her 2019 piece on Cats. Her timeline adds some delicious details about the narrative. When T.S. Eliot switched from Virginia Woolf's Hogarth Press, it was to a publishing house called Faber and Guire, and Faber, the elder, asked Eliot to be the godfather to his children. In 1931, Eliot sent 4-year-old Tom Faber an illustrated letter discussing Tom's cat and Eliot's cat, which was named Jelly Orem, in which Eliot expressed that he thought his cat was maybe better than Tom's cat, although he was very happy that Tom did have a cat. And one awesome thing about cats is that their names are cool. My own cats have been named Zaphod Beeblebrox, Stormageddon, and Evil Devil Creature. And maybe giving a cat a name isn't enough to be, like the entire plot for a 2-hour show, but it definitely is a fun part of cat ownership. All right. Stepping away from that side crest, then in 1936, he sent a letter to an adult friend named Polly Tandy, where he explained there were 4 different types of cats, separated by personality type and not species. And then he sent a separate letter to Tandy's daughter that he signed, Your Old Possum, which pretty directly links the letters to the later book, as did the complete poem in the letter about the Gumby cat. This is all review that we discussed in the last episode. The new detail is that on the Christmas Day of 1937, the BBC did a radio broadcast where the cat's poems were read. They went over well. There were 2 more installments. And if you've made it this far in life and maybe even seen the production on stage a time or two and you still don't know what a jellicle cat is, Tolentino reports that pollicle dogs and jellicle cats are Eliot's glosses on the way that posh British people said, poor little dogs and dear little cats. If instead you have heard that jellicle is just a nonsense word that doesn't mean anything, this is not far from that, but at least it is an origin story. In 1939, the book gets published, and it is 14 different poems describing 14 different cats. There's no mention of anyone named Grisabella or memories, and nothing about the Heaviside layer, whatever that is, but it takes on kind of a Dr. Seuss light-like momentum and becomes a book that British parents like to read to their kids, and 2 of those parents were musicians named Weber, and they read the poems to their son, Andrew Lloyd. Just to jump to the conclusion a little bit, in previous episodes, I poked fun at cats, and in the series on Phantom of the Opera, I pointed out that there are those who aren't huge Andrew Lloyd Webber fans, and part of that is his muted crediting of Gaston Leroux, the original author of the book Phantom of the Opera. But for cats, I think the correct conclusion is that Andrew Lloyd Webber is the guy who made the whole thing work, and he did so by taking some enormous chances with a deep belief in the power of live theater, and he wholly credited T.S. Eliot for his central role in that Old Possum's Guide to Practical Cats and how that played out in the production. Andrew Lloyd Webber's central start came as a musician and a composer. So when he grew up having read the Old Possum's Cats poems, he studied at the Royal College of Music in London, and he was making big splashes on Broadway. And just a few years after the Beatles had hit it big, so while the Fab Four were redefining pop music, he was redefining popular theater. And he did Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat in 1968, and then Jesus Christ Superstar in 1970, and Evita in 1978. Those are 3 pretty major successes to have under your belt, and they all came out in one 10-year period. So the story goes that one day during tech for Evita, he got bored. Doesn't everybody get bored at some point during tech? And he started toying with the idea of writing music for lyrics, which was a new thing for him because he'd always started with the music and then added the lyrics later, or rather he had Tim Rice add the lyrics later. According to Lloyd Webber himself in the coffee table book produced for the musical, this was around 1977. And at the 1980 Summer Simonton Festival, which is on Andrew Lloyd Webber's own country estate, he performed some concept stuff that included the Cats poems that he had set to music. As fate would have it, in attendance was none other than Valerie Elliott, T.S. Eliot's surviving spouse and literary estate curator, and she loved the idea and the performance. She agrees to back the project, but on the condition that it relies entirely on T.S. Eliot material. And kind of skimming over the details of that arrangement, the theater book for the show will need to rely almost exclusively on the work of T.S. Eliot, with a limited creative freedom to work around source material and take it from a children's book and into a adult full-length stage performance. You're not going to do that without any changes, but the deal was that Lloyd Webber had to stay as true as he could to the text, and by God, he did. As part of that, Valerie gave Andrew Lloyd Webber 8 lines of an unfinished poem that was called Grisabella. Eliot had started the idea and then he'd scrapped it, saying that it was too sad for children and that it was based too much on Villon's La Belle Ulmerie, Huelmeire, my French again, terrible. Obvi, I mean, who doesn't know that Villon wrote in the 1400s and then published in the 1500s and is considered one of the great French medieval poets, and that the specific poem in question is about a woman who laments the loss of youth and beauty and also an abusive spouse. The spouse is actually kind of pined for, not lamented, by the way. But the story goes that Eliot is writing his kids' poems. He starts off a cat poem named Grisabella, and then he gives up because he realizes that his ideas are too derivative of the medieval poet Fionn. If my emphasis here seems strange, this is going to matter because of how central Grisabella is to the musical, even though she's not in the book at all. And that will trigger enough commentary about the show that will dedicate an entire episode to what's up with Grisabella. But for now, Andrew Lloyd Webber will effusively and graciously credit and thank Valerie for her contributions. But this is where I think Andrew Lloyd Webber really takes a mostly harmless book of poetry and then changes Broadway forever. And the credit goes to him, to the director Trevor Nunn, and the choreographer Gillian Lynn, and then the rest of his production crew. Now, as an interesting connection, Andrew Lloyd Webber's production partner is Cameron Mackintosh. And at the time, he had on his resume Anything Goes, which was running in 1969, but closed after only 2 weeks, and then My Fair Lady from 1978. He'd been living a theater life of boom and bust through about 5 shows until he finally hits it big with Cats in 1981. He's the guy who would go on to do Les Mis in 1985, which, if there's anything bigger than Cats, probably Les Mis. That will cement his role as a theater icon, but he's not quite there yet when he's taking on Cats in 1980 and 81. 2 of the biggest producers of all time are joining on the show, and Cameron Mackintosh is the guy who will take less of a creative role, but it does the production work that is really going to play a role. Okay, so let's divide the tale of the production into things that go wrong and then the things that go right, because stories of near disaster are almost always more fun when they don't turn tragic. It starts when Twyla Tharp is approached to do the choreography, and she says no. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the name Twyla Tharp, as I was before my wife and my daughter mocked me and then lectured me, she's basically the creative mind behind almost all modern dance. And to add insult, there's one director that Andrew Lloyd Webber is making the pitch to who literally falls asleep. And now this is according to Tolentino, who I really trust. But I will say this story sounds a bit apocryphal. If you're a director and the guy who's done Evita and Jesus Christ Superstar, which at the time was the longest running musical in British history, pitches you, I'll bet you could at least stay awake, but not according to Lloyd Webber. And Andrew Lloyd Webber evidently is having trouble finding a theater to host what he himself is now calling a, quote, suicidally stupid musical, end quote. Nobody wants to finance it. Mackintosh actually has to take out newspaper ads to solicit random small fry investors just to get the capital for the show. And eventually both of the producers put their own money in. I am now going to read directly 3 paragraphs from Tolentino because I am not going to improve on the prose of this award-winning author. And because of the thousands of pages of stuff that I perused putting this together, this is the page that really stuck with me. Here we go. Quote, on the first day of rehearsals, Lloyd Webber's musical director slumped onto the piano keys and said he couldn't play anymore and then quit. Nunn clashed with Lynn. Lloyd Webber worried that his songs couldn't be sung properly through so much dancing. 12 days before the preview, Judi Dench, who had been cast as both Grisabella and the old Gumby Cat Jenny Anydots, collapsed mid-rehearsal and cried out, "Who kicked me?" She had snapped her Achilles tendon. It instantly became gossip that Judy's accident was an excuse for her to jump a sinking ship. I'm going to stop the quote for this interjection. This is actually not accurate. Dench would want to be in the show quite badly, and her trouble did not end with the Achilles tendon. So I'm going to supplement the Tolentino quote here and pick up with Trevor Nunn himself, who wrote this account at the Coffee Table Book, quote, quoting Nunn, when nearly 3 weeks later, Judy joined me in a deserted theater in the Haymarket where we had been rehearsing. She could hardly move, and she was as vulnerable as only the truly ill can be. The theater creaked, ghosts walked, and she sang her songs into the darkness of the empty auditorium for the only time. 2 days later, when she became determined to rejoin the show as scheduled, she lost her balance in a flurry of crutches and pitched off an entrance ramp into the rows of ungiving seats and hurt herself worse than before. End of the Nunn quote. Back to the Tolentino quote. 5 days before the preview, Lynn threatened to quit the show over a set of elaborate costumes for the opening number, which Napier, the costume designer and set designer, had spent 10% of the show's budget creating. They were difficult to dance in. Lynn won the argument, and Napier, fuming, kicked the costumes into the gutter. That same day, after witnessing a chaotic run-through of a number in which the cats pretended to be dogs, Lloyd Webber and Mackintosh told Nunn that what they'd seen was not fit for the stage and declared that they were pulling the show. Nunn ignored them. 2 days out, Elaine Paige, who had taken Dench's place as Grisabella, sang a version of Memory that featured the lethally depressive lyrics by Lloyd Webber's longtime collaborator, Tim Rice. I read these in the opening, but they go once again. Daylight. I won't care if it finds me, with no breath in my body, with no beat in my heart. Rice and Lloyd Webber were in the middle of ending their creative partnership, and the then married Rice had recently begun an affair with Paige, which had to add to the drama. Nunn insisted on rewriting the lyrics for the final rehearsal, where Paige sang Memory from a crumpled sheet of paper in her hand. On the Wednesday afternoon before the first preview in the West End, McIntosh and Lloyd Webber went to a bar to celebrate their respective careers in musical theater, which they presumed might be over in a few hours' time. They'd been hyping the production since a nationwide casting call 6 months before, but they kept aspects of the show secret. The public had no idea that Cats featured no human characters at all. That evening, Lloyd Webber steeled himself and went backstage. He looked at a young dancer who he'd persuaded to join Cats by assuring her that it would be a life-changing experience. In 3 minutes, he writes in his memoir, she would run on stage as a cat caught in a car headlight and instigate one of the great moments of bathos in theater history. End quote. Bathos, by the way, is a word that means amusing failure at attempted artistic greatness. The actual quote ends by saying, the overture seemed to last forever, and Lloyd Webber recalls, has there ever been such agonizing wait for the executioner's blow? End quote. That sense of doom was shared. A Warner Brothers executive predicted that Cats would, quote, go to the dogs. But as we know, it did not. And in fact, it would be well received. So what goes right? There are, I think, 3 things that makes this show work. And we're going to talk about the first one today. And the first one is Grisabella. We'll need to dig to see where she came from. Andrew Lloyd Webber took those 8 lines of poetry that T.S. Eliot had discarded, but Valerie had given to Webber, and mashed it up with another T.S. Eliot poem called Rhapsody on a Windy Night. And although the character was no part of the book, she is central to the musical. The big song, of course, is Memory, and what a success that song is. There's a composer named Puccini who Andrew Lloyd Webber admired, and parts of the music for the song Memory were taken from an earlier musical experiment Lloyd Webber had with Puccini's style. He actually had to take the song to his dad, who, remember, was a musical theater teacher, to assure him that it was only in the style of Puccini and was not open plagiarism of Puccini. I think it ended up being better than Puccini. Quick, name your favorite Puccini song. I'm drawing blanks, but Memory is memorable. According to Jessica Sternfeld, a PhD from Princeton, a lifelong musical theater fan who worked at Rhode Island College, is now at Chapman University right here in Irvine, California, and wrote a book in 2006 called The Mega Musical. The song has been recorded more than 600 times. It's been in the top 10 twice, once by Barbara Streisand and once by Barry Manilow, but it's also been recorded by Johnny Mathis and Judy Collins, according to Sternfeld. It took over the 1980s piano bars. Now, what Cats famously does not have is a plot. This point has sparked some of the wittiest comments among those who comment on the show, including both those who love it and hate it. Peter Coons, writing about movie adaptations, wrote that the movies have, quote, one major difficulty, its plot, or lack thereof, end quote. Sternfeld notes that there's a huge foreign audience for the show, which is due in part to the fact that not speaking English isn't really a barrier to missing the plot, because there isn't a plot to miss, and goes on to note, quote, a large number of English audience-speaking members also seem to miss a great deal of the text, end quote. Even if you know what's going on in English, there's no plot for you to catch. And Sarah Kaufman, writing a review for the 2016 revival, put it this way, the show, quote, begins and ends with feline fascination and goes nowhere in between, end quote. The show is nominally about how cats get their various names and maybe doing expositions on the different types of cats, think of characters without any action, and that's a pretty thin edge to balance your production on, your multi-million-dollar mega musical on. But the one moment that unites it all is that the Jellicle Ball is an occasion for the cat Old Deuteronomy to pick who gets to go to the Heaviside Layer. The Heaviside Layer is also a T.S. Eliot idea that's not part of the original cat poems, but it is mentioned in all of one couplet in the poem Rhapsody on a Windy Night. But the director Trevor Nunn and Lloyd Webber pull this out and use it as a uniting element for the show. Now, that's not much, but at least it gives the show a focal point. We're meeting all of these cats because one of them is going to get elevated somewhere, either to die or be reborn or get 9 more lives. Who really knows? What will motivate an audience to care about that? The answer is Grisabella and the song Memory. Peter Coons is writing for the Velvet Light Trap. He's got a PhD in English from Florida State and was a candidate for radio, TV, film degrees at Texas Austin when his article was published in 2017. So he actually might have 2 PhDs by now. And according to him, quote, Grisabella becomes the emotional core of Cats through her show-stopping performance of Memory. And quote, Jessica Sternfeld points out that it's not only the 11 o'clock number, it's a thread that runs through the show and is intentionally previewed, especially in the music early on. Sternfeld also points out that it's a power pop number that has a widespread appeal outside the context of theater. The fallen woman redeemed is the figure that brings the rest of this chaos together, and that is all due to Andrew Lloyd Webber and Trevor Nunn. So, a memorable and sympathetic character who delivers a power punch number right at the close is enough to pull the show together and at least to give it an ending. We'll talk later about what others make of Grisabella, but her presence in the musical, which is not in the book, is an absolutely integral part of what makes the show work. And in the face of everything Aristotle and Quintilian have to say about good rhetorical form, I'm going to end it here. After all, we are way past 40 minutes into this thing. We're way past our half-hour limit. And we've only got the point 1 of the 3 things that will probably make this show work. But we will talk about the other 2, which involve both sex and spectacle, and we'll do so in the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.